All right, we have until, like, you have stuff at 2:30 today, is that correct? Okay, so we'll see how time this is, but 2:15, 2:20, try and stick it out. I know that after it's like 50 minutes, that's when the bleed starts at Villanova. Any presentation that goes over 50 minutes, it just is like somebody just like slits the aorta, and they just all over the place. So we'll be able to stay together. I'm aware of your time, and we'll shoot to wrap up at like 20 after, something like that. All right. Last year, Ralph, it was the first time I had talked to the leadership group. You guys are all new, right?
Yes.
So why did I make a new presentation? That's the question that's facing me now. This is not what I did last year, basically. But the theme is different. The theme of what I'm talking to you today, hey, Christina, is about social responsibility. That's the sort of the theme of the leadership idea. And I want to spend some time talking about that idea and kind of breaking that down. I'm kind of playing with this idea in my own research. As some of you may know, I teach a course here on campus on genocide, and so I spend a lot of time, I'm with the Center for Peace and Justice, I spend a lot of time thinking about atrocity. I spend a lot of time thinking about why people do terrible, horrible, no good, very bad things to other people. And so that's this sort of macabre sort of research that I do, but I'm ultimately interested in what it means to be human, and what it means to have sort of agency, to how we conceive ourselves, how we think of ourselves in the world, how we operate vis-a-vis other people, and sort of the sort of animals that we are. So I tend to do a lot of focus on social, on biology, on neuroscience, and things like that, coupled with this study of genocide, which is a little bit unusual because that's usually not what you find in most research. But I find that this is a new kind of thing that is happening in research, and that science is really outstripping philosophy and sociology when it comes to understanding who we are as human beings. And so this is what my presentation is going to be on, is this sort of kind of where I am right now in this understanding of who we are as social beings. And so I have this tricky little word play of the idea of social responsibility to social responsibility. You could play that out, the ability to respond socially, or you could play with those words. But I think the reason I split these up is because social responsibility sounds like a burden. Social responsibility, when we think of that word, we always think of it as something we have to do. It's not something we would ever choose to do, but we must do it because we know that somehow it's better for us, or we're fulfilling a certain requirement, and so we have to do it. It's your responsibility to watch your little brother and make sure he doesn't get out. You know, it's your responsibility to get good grades so you can get a good job. It's your responsibility to take care of yourself so you don't fall apart. It's your responsibility, blah, 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 right? So that has a kind of a negative connotation, which I think is indicative of the way we think about and the way we have thought about who we are as social animals. And so I want to sort of focus on this idea, our ability to respond socially, our social responsibility, not as something that is foisted upon us, but actually something that is a part of who we are as human beings. And so this comes from really a self-understanding of who we are. And in many ways, we are inheritors of a culture and of a construct which is based on the idea of the selfish gene. It is sort of where we have been in the last 100 years, in the last 50 years of scholarship about genetics, about the way we think about our relationship to who we are. And I'm becoming increasingly impatient with the idea of the selfish gene. I grew up with this idea. I think you have too, although less so than me. I'm a generation in front of you. I'm your dad for many of you, right? But the more I look into it and the more I study science and the brain and the way we sort of act and operate, that this idea is coming under fire from me. And I'm becoming to see how the selfish gene is really a construct, a conglomeration of several factors in Western culture in particular that have come together to present this sort of idea about who we are as human beings. And part of this comes from my own study of history and science, but also a lot of it comes from my own experience in being in other cultures. I have spent quite a lot of time in Rwanda because of my work on genocide, and I have a summer course that I take over there every 3 years through Villanova. And so I've spent a lot of time in other cultures other than my own, and to start to see how other people on this planet sort of interact with one another has made me question whether or not this is a universal truth of the selfish gene, which is premised on the idea that at all points and at all times, the thing that we consider most when we consider what action we should take is based on the premise that we need to do the thing that will optimize our own benefits. And that this is an operational prerequisite that we come into everything we do. We judge, whether it's unconscious or not, we judge whether or not this action will be good for us. And when I say us, I mean me, individually. And that has been the way that most of this has come down. But I think there's a lot of things that have come into the way we have seen this. I don't want to go into too much of the historical details of it, but these are kind of the 4 things that I think have really shaped the way that we think about ourselves and the way we think about how we interact with people, especially when it comes to ideas of social responsibility, of what we think of as social responsibility as caring for other people, right? That's the burden that we carry. We have to care for other people. Why? Well, because that's a good thing, right? But it's really an antithesis of the selfish gene. First of all is the Enlightenment in the 18th century, and all I want to say about that is that this was the first time really in human history, and I would say this even, this is kind of daring, it's the first time in human history when people started to think of themselves as an autonomous I, a separate autonomous I that is completely separate from other people, and that relationships between people are at the choice or at the sort of the liberty of the people that choose to be in a relationship, that you choose to be in relationships with other people. You choose to do these things, and so we're not intrinsically connected to one another. We are an autonomous I that functions in a world with lots of other autonomous I's, and so our job is to sort of negotiate how we relate to those other I's to make sure that this I comes out with the most optimal result, right? That we get the most. And that takes a lot of negotiation. That takes sometimes you have to concede some things. You have to force other things. That's sort of the art of it. But that idea that we are an autonomous, separate I is almost so ingrained in us at this point that it's hard for us to consider anything else than that somehow we are intrinsically connected to other people. But this is something that comes out of the Enlightenment. It also then comes out of the idea of a free market economy, and that the free market economy is based on the idea that if every person pursues their own individual self-interest, then in the totality of the whole, everyone will succeed. It's a weird kind of ironic twist. This is Nash. This is beautiful mind stuff. Anybody do game theory? Anybody interested? Anybody study game theory at all? A few of you? Yeah, the premise is that you have to make all decisions based on what's best for you, and if another person is making their decisions based on what's best for them, then somehow that will reach what Nash called Nash's equilibrium, and that will create an economy or an equality between people, even though people are not getting everything they want. It's based on the premise that everyone must act in their own self-interest, and that if you don't act in your own self-interest, then you'll get screwed. Because you'll lose, because you assume that the other person is always acting on their best interest, so you have to act on your best interest in order to counteract their best interest, right? Which is what came out of the Cold War. And that's what resulted in the Cold War, this idea that we need to have as many weapons as them because we're assuming that they're going to destroy us if they have more, and the only way we can be assured that they're not going to destroy us is if we have as many, if not more. And then they're going to think, well, if they have more, they can destroy us, so the only way we can prevent them, because we assume they're going to destroy us, is for us to have a little bit more, and then it goes on and on and on, right? But it's premised on the idea that we are individuals out for our own good, and that the only people we care about is ourselves. The Cold War came out of I think what's underneath that is the sort of the Nazis. World War II impacted the way Western cultures thought about themselves and thought about the relationship of the I and the relationship of the group in a very negative way. And in many ways, the Nazis catapulted us into the Cold War, into that the understanding that we can't trust authority, that we can't trust the group to take care of the individual. Because what Nazi Germany showed was that if you give up your personal autonomy, you will be made to do atrocious things. And this is what the Nazis did with convincing the German culture and the German country to go along with World War II and in particular the Holocaust. And so that fear of being manipulated by a greater whole than yourself, and the way the West interpreted that was that Germans gave up their autonomy. They surrendered their own choice for a higher power, and even if they thought it was for the common good, they surrendered that autonomy. And when that happens, then atrocities happen. So what we took out of the Nazis, which when we applied to the Cold War, is that idea that it's very dangerous for you to give up your individual self-interest because you can pretty much be guaranteed that you will be taken advantage of. So for you to give up your self-interest somehow is a very dangerous thing. And out of that comes Ayn Rand, the sort of the fountainhead mentality, the sort of assumption that everyone is out to take from you, so the only thing you can do in response to that is to assume that they're going to take everything you and try to take it from them first. And therefore that's the Cold War, that's game theory, that's prisoner's dilemma, that's all of that stuff, which actually we're still very much in the midst of. And we live in a different world right now, but for the most part, culturally, we're still in that position. Which brings up the idea of peer pressure. I mean, and when you apply this sort of mentality down and boil it down to where you guys live, to where we live on a sort of day-to-day level, these all are geopolitical theories and sort of abstract ideas about surrendering to governments and all this kind of stuff. But in fact, it's actually affected the way that we think about something like peer pressure. My guess is that most of you think of peer pressure as a negative thing. And my guess is that most of your parents told you that peer pressure is a bad thing. And that if you give in to peer pressure, you will find yourself doing some very bad things, and that you'll give yourself up to the mob mentality, and it will take you down this path that will make you make terrible mistakes, and you'll find yourself living in your parents' basement just, sucking weed instead of succeeding. Succeed or suck weed. That's the idea, right? So so that again, that's the way that this has kind of come out. But I think this is what I'm questioning. And I think that the science that's coming out on this and the way we think about what it means to interact with other people and this sort of fear that we have of acting in groups, of being social, as though being social is going to compromise our integrity as autonomous islands, this atomic people. And by atomic, I mean atoms, like broken down into a singular thing that does not need anything else in order for it to be an atom. That's a very atomized, we live in a very atomized society, that it breaks down to that we are islands. And I don't need anyone to be attached to me unless I choose it, unless it's pleasurable for me, unless it's advantageous for me, unless I find some advantage in being in relationship with you. But for the most part, I want to make sure I maintain my individual integrity and not open myself up to the dangers of being vulnerable or interacting with people on that respect, unless I control it. Unless I control it. That's part of the language of that. This is where neuroscience starts to come in. This is what's kind of the interesting thing about what neuroscientists are finding out about the human brain, about the way that we interact in the world, about the way our brains think about other brains in the world, the way we think about ourselves. There are two things that are very social. There's two. Anybody do this? I'm just kind of curious. So anybody take a bio course in here? That anybody do neuroscience? You've done some bio on this kind of stuff? Okay, that's good. Not nearly enough, but that's all right. But there's kind of the way that, it's not going to get it's going to get a little technical, but not too bad. I'm not a scientist. I'm a historian, right? I come into this not from the history of science. I come in it as a historian who just wants to figure things out. So I'll try to make it understandable, right? But there are two ways in which neuroscientists are finding that we interact with other people. We do it through mirroring and mentalizing. Mirroring is what happens if you ever find yourself in a crowd or with another person, and you begin to mirror their demeanor. You mirror sometimes their facial expressions. That's like when somebody laughs and you laugh too, but you don't know why you're laughing because I don't really know. But you just laughed there. So, but we do this unconsciously. We have a way of mirroring what happens. Babies do this. Mammals do this. Chimps do this. Primates do this all the time in sort of a rudimentary way. And this is sort of an autonomic response. This is something that is stimulated in our brain, but it only comes from a particular part of our brain, right? About mirroring, about the way that we do that. And we do this unconsciously, and it's a way that we bond or connect with other people around us. But then there's another part. The mirroring answers the question, what are they doing, right? But mentalizing is something that is distinctly human, and this is what they're finding out, that this is the question which we ask ourselves when we're with other people, and we ask ourselves why they're doing it. And this is something that's distinctive from other mammals, from primates. This is something that's distinctly human, that we have the ability not only to mirror, but also to mentalize. And the interesting thing is that this comes from a different part of our brain than the mirroring part. The mirroring part is from one part, but the mentalizing comes from is more from our prefrontal cortex. This is this part of the brain right up here, that top level. If you see, I have a picture of the brain a little bit, but it's kind of that top layer. This is where we just blow other mammals out of the water. The amount of our cortex, which is where we do, it's like our hard drive, it's our RAM, it's how much stuff we can store, how much we can process at any one time. We can process so much more information from our environment than other mammals or even primates, even our closest relatives. We just blow them out of the water. And that's where mentalizing comes in. And mentalizing is this of the thing that we do, and we do it so instinctually that we're not even aware of it. And part of what's interesting about looking at this sort of stuff is you become aware of the things that you take for granted so much. And mentalizing is the idea of, like when I'm teaching, I see people yawning. Sometimes they're like pretending not to yawn. They try to do like that, and their eyes sort of flicker, and then they start to water up, and they kind of quiver a little bit, and I know they're yawning, right? And I'm mentalizing, and I'm able to mentalize that isn't just a display of odd facial expressions to me. Like I know what they're doing, and I'm suppressing the urge to yawn myself. Yawn. How many people are how many people are fighting back a yawn right now? Come on, show of hands. Yes, that's mirroring. Yeah, no, I'm like all tingly right here. I gotta yawning is contagious. Yawning is one of those mirroring things. Like you don't control that. That's mirroring. Look at that's a fantastic one. I know that was that was bold. I like that. But mentalizing is asking yourself not just what's happening in mirroring, but why are they happening? Oh, they're tired. Oh, they're bored. Oh, it's 2 p.m. on a Friday, which is the new Saturday, right? It's Saturday to you now, actually, because Friday's like coming in on Saturday, because Thursday's the new Friday. That would make this Saturday. But so this is what's different about us. And so what we do is there's this term called affect matching, and this leads to distress. When we see someone in distress, we not only see what they're doing, but we read their minds and we see that affect, and that causes distress in us. And this is autonomic too. We don't choose to do this. So when we see someone in trouble, when we see them crying or in distress, we feel that too. And that triggers a fight or flight in us. In the same way that when somebody comes up behind us and boom, grabs us, that shot of adrenaline, that fight or flight thing, we do that mentally as well. And that can trigger two things. We can either fight to get rid of that distress, This is what causes distress in our brain. When we see people in distress, we mirror that, and we also mentalize it, and then we want to get rid of it. This is what comes down to social responsibility in a little ways, in one little way, is that choice about whether we fight or flight is something that you can have control of. Just like what you can fight, or you can choose to fight or flight when somebody attacks you, you can also choose to fight or flight. Now, most people, when they see, I don't know, you watch TV at night, you see these the commercials for all these African children that are starving, and you know, and you see these horrible pictures of these children, and they have these distended bellies, and they show them close up with their eyes, and the flies around them, and everything, and you have this response. How many times do you pick up the phone and call? Or how many times do you just change the channel? That's fight or flight. Seeing that sort of thing elicits a response in us most of the time, and I'm the first to say it, I just change the channel because I feel manipulated, right? But I also know that this makes me feel something that I don't want to feel, and it's a fight or flight thing. And mostly I run from that sort of thing because I think that's manipulative. But anyway, it's not as important as that moment when you see that thing. And that's an important part of what it means for us to be human. And this happens, they're finding, whether we want to happen or not. This is not something we choose. This just happens when it's triggered, when we see this kind of stuff. So the question is, why be good? And what we're finding out, and what neuroscientists are finding out about goodness, about acting, about addressing that distress by doing something to solve it, instead of just running away from it, that there is a lot of emerging sciences that says that when we act good, that we feel good, that we tend to favor kindness and fairness over inequity. In the prisoner's dilemma thing, there's an experiment where you have this thing where you can either take the bet, you have a bet, you each have $5, and you don't know what your partner is going to do, and you say, well, if you accept to compromise or share, and they decide to take it all, then they take it all and you lose all the money. But if you decide not to share and they decide not to share, then you both don't get it. Or if you both decide to share, then you both get some and not others. You know, that's prisoner's dilemma. And what game theory says is you should always assume the other person's going to take, and you should always refuse to share, because at least you'll never get taken advantage of that way. Because either they will not share and you'll get it all, or you'll both not share and you'll both get nothing, but that's equal. And what's worse is if you decide to share and they don't, then you lose because they win. That's what game theorists, that's what Nash said the best response to that is. But when they hook up people to fMRIs, this functional magnetic resonance imagery equipment, and they do the same prisoner's dilemma with the same scenario, what they find is that if someone wins, that certain parts of the pleasure centers of their brain, which is kind of deep in, like 2 inches in, 2 inches down, this sort of right on the cusp of the midbrain and the cortex, there are pleasure centers in the brain that light up. But what they've also found, and this is the surprising part, is that the same pleasure centers light up when people decide to be fair. And in fact, they've shown that being fair and having fairness and the perception of fairness when both win is actually more pleasurable to us than when we win and they lose. Because of that mentalizing, that when we see someone lose, we mentalize that, and that detracts from our pleasure, the pleasure centers of our brain, that we're kind of wired to actually favor a cooperative end when both of parties win. Even if we don't get as much as we thought we could, we will tend to do that because that's more pleasurable. And if you play the prisoner's dilemma over time, it becomes that people eventually work themselves out into always compromising, always cooperating at all times, all the time. And that's what Nash didn't talk about. And that's what game theory doesn't tell you, is that we actually enjoy cooperation more than we enjoy being selfish. We get more pleasure out of that. So the idea of why to be good really is an existential question. But it's very easily answered. From a neurological point of view, you do good because it feels good. It feels good. Boom, that's it. A lot of times we have, why be good? Well, because it will help us later on. We can utilize that relationship. That will help us. Or maybe, I mean, I come from an evangelical / fundamentalist tradition, so why being good was very easy to answer because you didn't want to go to hell. You were good because you wanted to make sure that you were not bad, because if you're bad, you're going to burn in hell for eternity. But if you're good, you've got a chance of getting into heaven. So you want to be a good person so that when you meet St. Peter at these pearly gates, boy, you pull out your wallet and boom, you got it. How much is that going to cost again? No problem. Making it rain up here in heaven, right? So that's the idea of that we usually think of it as a calculation. I think this is what we've inherited, that we tend to think that it's only good to be good if it's good for us. Somewhere down the line when we can exploit that relationship or take advantage of that thing, we can learn to win friends and influence people and learn how to later on pull in those favors, and then boom, we got it, right? We can leverage that kind of stuff. We've been kind of taught to do that. So think of that in that way. But from a neurological standpoint, it doesn't pan out. In fact, what we're doing is that one of the things that makes us human is actually our ability to move beyond that sort of commerce, sort of exchange of things back and forth to actually operate at another level. And this is where you get crossing over from just being a mammal to actually being sapien, right? And it has to do with oxytocin and empathy, and this is where we're gonna do a little brain action on you. Okay, this is the idea I was kind of talking about before. Anybody heard of oxytocin? Anybody know what this stuff is? This is good shit. You want this. If they can ever put this in a pill, this would be amazing stuff. Oxytocin is that stuff you feel, that wave when you sink into your partner's eyes and just drown. Right? When you're in love and when you're infatuated in that first, and you just look in their eyes and you just like, oh my gee, what is happening to me? Like that feeling, that rush, that's oxytocin. When mothers and fathers hold the baby for the first time and you lock eyes and they just stare into your eyes and you feel that rush, that like, oh my God, that's oxytocin. Right? When you look at even other people's eyes, even for even more than a fraction of a second, you can get that thing. Now, if I were to do that here, and I won't because you're far away, but I sometimes do this. If you look into someone's eyes and you look at for more than a split second, because usually we dance off people's eyes and we can read them really fast, and we don't need to spend a lot of time on that because we're super good at analyzing. But if you lock eyes with someone and you hold that for more than like a 0.1, 2, boom, it gets weird, creepy, really, really fast. Because what you're feeling is that rush of oxytocin, but it's out of context, right? Like, I don't know why I'm feeling this. I used to act in plays when I was in college, and that was one of the things I knew that I couldn't be an actor because I couldn't pretend to look at someone and pretend like I was in love with them because I really felt like I was in love with them, and that freaked me out. I was like, I don't want to feel that. That's like, I'm not in love with you, but you know, but that's oxytocin. Oxytocin helps us to trust people. That's why when women are in labor, they get oxytocin flooded into their bodies because they have to trust people, right? And so that's part of that idea of just, that's really, really an important drug, right? So what happens is an oxytocin comes from, this is more the pleasure centers right here. This is this part I was talking about. This is the cortex, and this is what's called the midbrain, or the septal region right in here. There's a real clutch of really, really important things that have to do with emotion and things. And when we're good and when we're kind, and they've done these things, that when we see people that we know, there's a release of oxytocin, and there's activity in this septal region, which would trigger, which would indicate oxytocin and serotonin are at work, right? And so that idea of that this is pleasurable for us to be around people we know, but it doesn't work if we see people that are known hostiles or known enemies to us. But here's the interesting point, and this is new. This just came out, and I gave a talk to the ROTC people earlier this week on the nature of killing. So I had 110 midshipmen, and we were talking about why people kill other people, right? Which was a pretty intimidating talk. But what we were talking about, what I kind of brought into that, which I think is really interesting, is that they found that not only do we get a shot of activity in this pleasure centers of our brain when we see someone we know, but also that when we see people that we don't know, but we don't know if they're friend or foe. Like just of people that look different than us, we find that pleasurable too. But we don't feel it when we know somebody is hostile to us or an enemy or something. But that's a really important distinction, I think, because we tend to think that we only feel pleasure for people we know and who have established relationships with us and who we feel safe with and who we can trust and all these things, and that's all true. But if you look at the science, we also feel pleasure just by looking at other people, by connecting with other people. And we don't have to know whether they're an enemy or a friend, but our default mode, and this is what's really the important part, like our default mode is to connect. Our default mode is to feel good about being curious about other people, about connecting with people, even if we don't know who they are. Now, over time, if you build that up, that trust, that only enhances that relationship, but our default mode is not suspicion. Not suspicion, and that's different from what your culture tells you. That is not true. That is not true. But you can build that up. You can build up that idea, but it's not necessarily our default mode from a neurological standpoint, unless you can affect other parts of this, like the amygdala, which is down here, which is more the fear centers of the brain. Once you start enhancing this fear centers of the brain, that can override this stuff no problem, because that's life or death stuff. And so if you start seeing enemy and you start associating signals with enemy and hostility, then you won't feel that pleasure at all. But this is something that you can control, but that's kind of on down the line. And this is the idea of empathy. When you couple mentalizing, that idea that we're able to mentalize and see from another person's point of view, and also that it's pleasurable for us to see other people, and that we don't like to see people in distress, that's empathy. That's one of the things that is one of the major attributes that human beings have that other mammals don't, that has distinguished us in ways that has made it possible for us to be all over this planet. It has been possible for us to live in community in huge urban centers, because we're an urban species, by the way. We're not rural. We gravitate towards cities. Like 80% of the population or 85% of the world's population live in urban centers. Like, we totally gravitate towards cities. We love cities, right? And as much as people romanticize about the small towns, and I grew up in a small town, so I know this is true, that's not where people gravitate toward. That's where people run from sometimes. And even when they say they want to live in a small town, they don't want to live in a small town. Trust me, you don't want to live in a small town. I mean, some people do like to, I guess, but by and large, So those are really, really important. So we get this idea that that kindness is not necessarily something that we learn per se, or that the wiring for kindness is already in us. That's our default mode. That's the way we come into this world. We come into this world to connect with people. We come in looking for ways to connect with people. And that mentalizing, that idea of seeing people, of seeing intentions and reading intentions in other people, which we're incredibly good at, is part of the way that we want to connect with them, because we are naturally geared to help and cooperate, because that's our default mode. Now, if that gets pushed back, if we get rejected, then there are other mechanisms that kick into that, and we can become suspicious to the point where we can see another person and see an enemy in them. I'm not saying that is not part of it either, but I'm trying to get down to that essential part, like what are the first things that kick in how we relate to other people. So the challenge the challenge to our culture, and this is a challenge to our culture, what I'm talking to you about, because this sounds like what I'm telling you is to be naive, is to be trusting, is to let people take advantage of you, is to do all this stuff, and that's actually not what I'm saying at all. But that's what our culture tells us. It tells us that helping is hard and that it's unnatural. That being social is a responsibility. It's something that is unnatural to us. We have to work really hard at it, and we only do it so that we can maybe quell that guilt that maybe exists because we don't think that we're doing enough for whatever reason, whether we want to get into heaven, or whether we just want to be a good person, or whether we want to leverage that good action so we can show off to other people and gain social credibility with it. It doesn't really matter. But that's where that challenges our culture. It also is a challenge to your theology, right? It's a challenge to a theology that tells you that you are naturally sinners and that you are in need of help. That's the basic human condition, is to be a sinner, and that if you are left to your own devices, you will just dive into sin and cruelty and meanness. And there's There's a legacy of this as well. I'm not just saying Catholic. I'm just saying this is not just about Christianity. There are other traditions that have this as well. But this is a real challenge to that, this sort of construct of understanding what it means to be human. Whoops. So we have some barriers. What are the barriers that we have actually to get behind this, to actually understand and to get to this place where we're unlocking this sort of idea? Empathy is a huge part of it. Empathy is essential to who we are. It's that we have all the abilities to do it, but what scientists are finding out is that empathy is not necessarily, it has to be learned. It's not something that's automatic in us, which is a little bit weird. What I'm saying is that the wiring is all there, the apparatus is there, the tendencies are there, but the idea of empathy is something that it's called the theory of the mind. And the premise of theory of the mind is that there was a time, and we know, I don't know if you have any really narcissistic friends who the whole basis of narcissism is the fact that there are people out there who can't see the world through anybody else's eyes but their own. So if it's good for them, then why wouldn't it be good for you? Like, why wouldn't it be good for anyone? Because it fits me perfectly. Like, this system works great. Like, how could anybody complain about this? It works just fine for me. Those are people with